Hey Whappers, welcome into another version of Around the World here. Today we're going to be continuing on the vein of looking at our classical empires, but I'm going to sort of cover them not specifically about any details about any one individual classical empire, but instead I want to look at how these classical empires were connected, and they were connected primarily through trade. Throughout AP World History, trade is a seminal topic. It is one that can be through any era, really, especially once we hit period 2 here with the classical eras, but especially going forward. Establishing the premise that trade was a foundational necessity for empires to be built and connected. Not only does trade increase the economic standing of any empire, but in looking at the diffusion of cultures across different continents, the transfer of raw goods and materials across different regions, the spread of religions, the spread of ideas, trade has an all-powerful, almost omnipotent effect throughout world history. And certainly from the standpoint of the College Board, it considers trade and understanding the principles of trade to be of the utmost importance. So from looking at the big picture here, your knowledge of trade routes is crucial to understanding how the world became shaped the way it is, because it's not just about the goods that flowed on these trade routes. It's about the peoples and the ideas and sometimes the diseases and the armies that wreaked havoc all across the world. So this has a tug of war type, good, bad, yin, yang type appeal. And I want to start you guys looking at how in the classical era, where we had that activity the other day in class where we did the mixing and matching, the line dancing activity. We're focusing on trade routes today in the conversation that touch a lot of these regions, specifically China, Rome. So we're looking at the Han and the Roman Empire, or maybe talking about trade routes through India. So that means the Mauryan and the Gupta. But anytime we're talking about these regions, you want to just think about the premise of trade and what it represented, and the specific in and outs of each empire. There's a time and a place to cover those. But I'm taking tonight, and we'll really talk, on this video and moving forward about trade, and this is always a good opportunity to see how the past connects to the past shapes the future. Really, trade is a great way to look at that. So, I kind of have a few trade routes highlighted here, and some of these you would have learned last year. So, I'm going to pick my battles, and you should see eventually here I have maps. I'm going to put up maps in the video, so it gives you guys a sense of where we are, and you can kind of compartmentalize these trade routes that way. And obviously, the major one, the most famous ancient trade route of all time would be the Silk Roads. And the Silk Roads connected China with Rome and the Mediterranean world, so essentially Europe. And this is a trade route that had over 4,000 miles of roads laid out, trade routes that went over mountains and through underpasses and through past rivers and lakes. And really, it is crucial in looking at how different continents were connected. The Silk Roads really brought Eurasia, that's Europe and Asia, together. And the foundation for the roads came about during the classical era, primarily with the Han Empire. You want to relate the Han Empire with the flourishing Silk Roads of their time. And really, who else benefited greatly from the Silk Roads would be the Romans, because this was around the same time period. And that's why oftentimes in AP questions, the Han and the Roman are tied very closely together. The connection of Europe and Asia was absolutely paramount to the spread of ideas and goods. In fact, that's one of the ways that it's believed that civil service exams flowed from China under the Confucian Hans all the way into Rome. These ideas can spread. It's not a very hard concept, of course, looking at how our world spreads today through social media and the internet. Well, this was their version of that. But with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the security, and the Han Empire as well, the security of the Silk Roads became very tenuous. And it wasn't until the Mongols took over China, which you guys would have covered last year, it wasn't until the Mongols took over China that the Silk Roads became safe again. So they did go through some peaks and valleys, but the Silk Roads are going to be a trade route that always comes up and is always referred to as probably the classic of the classic trade routes. But let's stay with the Romans here, because that's one of the ways that the Romans built such a massive empire, stretching from the Middle East into North Africa, and as well as obviously different parts of Europe. But their home base, of course, in Italy. One of the trade routes that the Romans dominated, not just along the Silk Roads, was there was a precious stone. Precious stones were traded along what was known as the Amber Road. And the Amber Road connected Rome with other parts of Europe. And again, a lot of these trade routes, they get their name from the one main good, right? Silk Road, we have to assume that silk was traded there, but it wasn't the only kind of thing traded. So just be aware that the name of the route is often tied to the one particular resource, but that doesn't mean it was the only thing traded. So the Amber Road was a key trade route, and in the Roman Empire, connecting Rome with various parts of Europe, as you can see with the map. And along the same lines, the Romans also developed what was known as the ancient salt routes. And these salt routes were a big part of the success of the North African region of the Roman Empire. And the salt trade will later in history be a really crucial part of why Africa was ripe for Europeans to come looking for trade routes in the 1500s, and that would open things up for the slave trade. So that's a little piece of past shaping the future. So the Romans were involved with the Silk Roads in China. The Romans were involved with the Amber Roads, the Amber routes in Europe, and they also had access to the salt trade in North Africa. But let's go back to China real quick, because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one other key ancient Chinese trade route, and that would be the Tea Horse Road. The Tea Horse Road was well known in the ancient world for being the most treacherous pass of any trade route. It knifed its way through around lakes and rivers, and especially into the mountainous region towards the Himalayas in China. And again, tea, as in tea, what you drink, very important to Chinese culture, very important commodity that the Chinese would sort of dominate and corner the market on. And so the tea horse routes were crucial for the Chinese to connect to other parts of Asia, especially India and other parts of Southeast Asia. So that's what the tea horse routes were known for. And the tea horse routes also are important primarily because they reference horse, which were the domesticated animals that the traders, the merchants, were allowed or were able to use as they passed through these treacherous roads. And it goes without saying that one of the effects we talked about with the Neolithic Revolution was pastoralism, domestication of animals. Well, you wouldn't be in this position to trade long distances like on the Silk Roads or the Amber Roads or the Salt Roads or the Tea Road here without animals, because horses carried people long distances much further than the humans could walk themselves. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but don't discredit the importance of trade routes, growing trade routes with animals, the use of animals. And that brings me to my next point, which is looking at the incense road. The incense road is a really underrated trade route because, again, it's going to put the Romans right in the mix of things, but it also put other areas of the Mediterranean region in direct contact with Arabia. Now, there really wasn't an empire in Arabia up until the Islamic empires come about in the 600s and 700s. But Arabia was kind of a fractured region of many tribes. But one thing that those different tribes did in Arabia was they proved that the camel could be a domesticated resource in transporting goods long distances. So while the Chinese figured out how to domesticate the horse for trade on their routes with the Tea Horse Road and the Silk Roads, Arab tribes were learning to domesticate camels. And these camels proved to be absolute studs in terms of transporting heavy hauls over long distances in hot desert climates. And the incense road, that got its name from perfumes, from incense. And these were used for hygiene purposes, but also they were seen as a luxury good for the wealthy. So the incense routes got their name from that good, but the key there and the tie-in with the tea horse roads is using domesticated animals as a way to carry goods is a hallmark of early trade and future trade routes we'll talk about. So, these trade routes that I've covered, they show ingenuity, they show creativity, and they show the ability to connect. And that connection point is crucial. And that's really something I want you guys to hopefully just remember from your previous year's studies, or, again, if this is your first crack at world history, realizing that peoples in different areas were connected through trade. And, tonight when you guys work on the cap for the document, it's one of Ashoka's rock edicts. And these were different, and I'm going to put the map up here. These were different rocks that different codes of law that were put on rocks all throughout his empire. But what you notice on the map is take a look at where on the map they have everything. They're all near the border, which tells you that Ashoka was strategic in putting these routes near borders where he knew traders would be coming into his empire. So he wanted people entering the Mauryan Empire to get a sense of the Buddhism philosophies and get a sense of their codes of law. So, this is a great example of tying in what we're talking about, the importance of trade routes in the ancient world, to in talking about the importance of codes of law, something that we know that goes way back to early civilizations, because Ashoka put these near the entrance into his country, into his empire. And so again, the big takeaway here ultimately comes down to your ability not just to have a familiarity with some of these early trade routes and know where they are in the maps, but more or less it's looking at how empires start to connect and realizing that it's through trade that empires connect. And when empires connect through trade, that opens the door for culture, that opens the door for the spread of goods and religions, which we'll be talking about a lot more next week. I promise we'll get into a recap on religion. And I want everyone to sort of just, again, contemplate on how trade is a great connector. It's really throughout the ancient world and into even the modern world, the ultimate form of connection between different regions, different peoples. And so I leave you with, again, a couple classical empire trade routes. And I hope that this has helped, again, joggle your memory. Good luck with the cap in your notebook tonight. And again, remember, we got that quiz on Friday. So I wish you guys the best of your Wednesday nights. As always, the past shapes the future. Have a good evening.